London, 1897. A city draped in flags, flooded with cheering crowds and echoing with the anthem, "God Save the Queen." It was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. An extraordinary celebration of 60 years on the throne. She was now 78 years old, Empress of India, and sovereign over an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe. But as the golden carriage rolled through the streets, something was striking. The Queen barely waved, dressed head to toe in black, her expression somber, almost distant. To most, she was the embodiment of imperial grandeur. But inside that carriage sat a woman who hadn't fully recovered from a single day in 1861. Victoria never truly stepped out of mourning. For decades, she was known as the Widow of Windsor. Her public silence became symbolic of dignity, of loss, of mystery. But behind that veil of grief, behind the stoic public image, lay someone far more complex. She wasn't always a widow. She wasn't always withdrawn. And her marriage to Prince Albert, so often painted as a perfect love story, was more complicated than fairy tales allow. As a young queen, Victoria had been headstrong, impulsive, even playful. But the moment she married Albert, her world began to shrink. He was intelligent, moral, disciplined qualities she admired. But slowly they became a kind of prison. Albert didn't just support her rule, he structured it. He revised her speeches, managed her diary, and kept her pregnant for much of their marriage. In private, he scolded her for being emotional. In public, he shaped her image. It wasn't abuse, it wasn't cruelty, but it was control, and Victoria, though deeply in love, felt it. She later wrote in one of her thousands of journal entries, "Marriage is a very trying thing." After Albert's death, she became frozen in time, not only out of grief, but out of disorientation. Her decision maker, her mirror, her guide was gone, and for a while, so was she. But here's the paradox. It was precisely through this grief that Queen Victoria began to find her own power. She wrote endlessly, over 50 million words across decades of journals and letters. She wrote about politics, about dresses, about dreams and nightmares, about rage, about desire, about laughter. Her children found her words so candid, so vulnerable, that many were destroyed after her death. What remained, though, is enough to change how we see her forever. Queen Victoria wasn't just the emblem of an empire. She was a woman who craved connection, who wept over old songs, who hated formal dinners, who loved dogs more than most diplomats, who laughed often, and most of all, who recorded everything. Her words, scrawled in elegant cursive, tell a story no photograph could, that even the world's most powerful woman was terrified of being alone. And yet she endured. In this series, we'll follow Victoria through her journals, her losses, her loves, and her liberation from a life written by others to a story she finally owned herself. This isn't just the story of a queen. It's the story of a woman who lived longer, felt deeper, and defied more expectations than history ever gave her credit for. They called her the Widow of Windsor. For 36 years, she wore black. She shunned public appearances, wrapped herself in mourning, and lived in the shadows of a man long gone. But what if that grief, overwhelming and all-consuming, was not the end of her story, but the beginning? In 1861, Queen Victoria lost not only her beloved husband, Prince Albert, but also her mother, two pillars of her emotional world gone within months. The nation watched as she disappeared from view. Newspapers accused her of abandoning the crown. Parliament grew frustrated. But deep inside the halls of Osborne House, Victoria wasn't idle. She was unraveling and then quietly rebuilding. Her journals, written with raw intensity, speak of a woman broken but not destroyed. From the greatest to the smallest thing, my first thought was always, "I must ask Albert," she wrote. She clung to his memory so tightly that it nearly crushed her. What many didn't see, however, was how dependent Victoria had become. Albert had not just been her partner, he had been her decision-maker. He helped choose her dresses, guided her politics, even shaped her opinions. Over time, love had evolved into dependence, and that dependence had made her, ironically, the least sovereign of sovereigns. But in the silence that followed his death, something unexpected stirred. Stripped of Albert's control, Victoria began to rediscover her own voice. In 1862, she returned to Coburg, Albert's birthplace and part of her own German heritage. There in the forested hills of Thuringia, something shifted. No longer the tightly managed monarch of court schedules and royal scripts, Victoria walked through the woods alone, breathed in the pine air, and remembered who she was before Albert. In her journal she wrote, "If I were not who I am, my true home would be here." She chose not to stay in the grand palaces of her relatives. Instead, she spent her time in a small hunting lodge called Floss Rosenau, where Albert had played as a boy. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was reclamation. Here, Victoria was not a queen. She was simply a woman grieving, healing, and learning to exist without being defined by someone else. She signed visitor books with aching simplicity, Victoria Regina, the desolate widow of my beloved Albert. But Coburg didn't just offer her solitude, it gave her clarity. Slowly, she began re-engaging with politics. Her letters to ministers resumed. She started reading more foreign briefings. She watched her children closely, especially her daughter Vicky, married to the Crown Prince of Prussia. Even in grief, she was growing sharper, more independent. This was a queen no longer dictated by a husband's agenda. She began tentatively at first to make choices on her own. This chapter of her life reveals a truth we often overlook in history. Sometimes we are born again through loss. Victoria's widowhood wasn't the curtain call, it was the second act. And as we'll see in the next part, it took an unlikely rugged Scotsman named John Brown to coax her even further out of the shadows and back into the light. In the years following Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria remained hidden from the public eye. For nearly a decade, she lived in deep retreat, emotionally, politically, and physically. The court grew restless, the newspapers impatient, and ministers concerned. But it wasn't diplomacy or duty that coaxed her back into life. It was something, or rather someone, far less expected. Enter John Brown, a rugged Scottish gillie 7 years her junior, blunt to the point of rudeness and completely indifferent to royal protocol. He had served Albert during their Highland retreats in Balmoral, and after Albert's death he continued to serve Victoria, but in a very different way. What began as a service role soon turned into something much more profound. John Brown wasn't afraid of the Queen. He didn't bow and scrape. He spoke plainly, often calling her woman to her face. And astonishingly, she loved it. To a woman so long imprisoned by protocol, the irreverent honesty of Brown was like fresh air. While ministers walked on eggshells and servants tiptoed through halls, Brown stomped through her grief with muddy boots and a whiskey-soaked accent. One famous story recalls a royal footman spilling a tray. The Queen erupted in anger, demanding he be punished. Brown immediately intervened. "Woman, what are you doing shouting at the lad? Have you never dropped something yourself?" The Queen, stunned into silence, laughed. It wasn't just his defiance she enjoyed, it was his presence. Brown made her feel protected, grounded, real. In her journals, she called him my devoted friend and wrote that he was the only person who spoke to me as Albert did. Naturally, this closeness stirred outrage. The court despised him. Ministers called him the Queen's stallion behind closed doors. Rumors of a secret marriage ran wild in the press. They said he entered her bedroom without knocking. that he slept in a room beside hers, that he dared to touch her hand. But did they have a romantic relationship? That question still divides historians today. Some argue there's no evidence beyond affection. Others point to a ring found on her finger after death, one allegedly belonging to Brown's mother. What we do know is this: Victoria broke every expectation of royal decorum just to keep him close. She wrote books about their time together, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, a deeply personal, almost whimsical account of their adventures in Scotland. In one passage, she describes watching him compete in the Highland Games, admiring his strength, his spirit, and humorously his exposed knees beneath a kilt. But these weren't just memoirs. They were love letters to freedom. Through John Brown, Victoria experienced something she hadn't felt in years: laughter-nature companionship without judgment. Yet this came at a cost. Her children hated him. Her staff conspired against him. Politicians rolled their eyes, but Victoria didn't care. She was for once living not as a symbol, but as a woman who dared to be close to a commoner, a woman who ignored etiquette in favor of emotional truth. And when Brown died in 1883, Victoria was devastated. She ordered a life-size statue of him to be erected at Balmoral, inscribed simply, "Friend more than servant loyal, devoted selfless." Years later, when she died, mourners discovered something extraordinary among the personal items placed in her coffin: a photograph of John Brown, a lock of his hair, and the ring his mother's still on her finger. For all the grandeur of empire and legacy, what Victoria truly held closest were moments like these: raw, unguarded, unapologetically human. In the wake of John Brown's death, many feared Queen Victoria would once again vanish into mourning. But history had other plans. As fate would have it, a very different kind of man entered her life. Someone just as shrewd, just as bold, but this time politically electrifying. Benjamin Disraeli, twice Prime Minister of Britain, was unlike any politician Victoria had known. He was witty, theatrical, charming, a novelist before he was a statesman. But most importantly, he understood something few others did. Victoria didn't want to be managed. She wanted to be seen. Disraeli treated the Queen not as a burden or an obstacle, but as a partner in grandeur. He called her fair and majestic sovereign, sent her letters full of flowery praise, and once knelt down to kiss her hand, saying, "In loyalty and faith, your devoted servant." And Victoria, she was delighted after years of cold ministers and somber grief. Here was someone who made her laugh again. But this wasn't just flirtation. Together they reshaped monarchy and empire where John Brown had revived her heart. Disraeli reignited her ambition. He had grand dreams for Britain, and Victoria was central to them. He envisioned a monarchy that wasn't just ceremonial, but symbolic of national pride and imperial identity. To make that vision real, he crowned her not just queen, but empress. On January 1st, 1877, Queen Victoria officially became Empress of India. The announcement was theatrical, strategic, and deeply political. It was meant to solidify British authority in the East and elevate the Queen's image across the world. Victoria adored the new title. In her journal, she wrote, "My thoughts much taken up with the great event of Delhi today, and in India generally, where I am being proclaimed Empress." Ironically, she never set foot in India, but the symbolism was potent. Through Disraeli's eyes, she was more than a figurehead, she was a living emblem of empire. Their correspondence reveals a level of emotional honesty rare in political partnerships. Disraeli often used romantic language, comparing her to heroines in poetry. And unlike others, he never underestimated her. He recognized her sharp instincts, her complex emotions, and her need for connection. He gave her something no one else in politics dared: affection without condescension. And it worked. Victoria, who once resisted public duties, began taking a more active role. She read foreign reports. She offered opinions on appointments. She began to feel once more that she mattered not just as a widow, not just as a woman, but as a monarch. Yet, as with all things, the end came too soon. Disraeli's health declined rapidly. On his deathbed, Victoria wrote to him constantly, even offering to bestow a peerage, Lord Beaconsfield, as a final gesture of honour. He accepted the title, but never lived to enjoy it. His death left her heartbroken once again. She wrote, "I am terribly upset by this loss, the loss not only of a servant but of a real friend." Still, something had changed permanently. Victoria was no longer just the secluded widow or emotionally wounded sovereign. She was now a global figurehead, the symbol of British might crowned with a new name, Empress. She would carry that title with fierce pride to the end of her life. By the 1880s, Queen Victoria was aging. She had outlived most of her trusted allies, Albert John Brown Disraeli. Her empire, now vast and formidable, marched onward. But inside the royal corridors, the Queen found herself increasingly alone. That is until a young Indian servant named Abdul Karim entered her world and turned it upside down. He arrived in 1887, a gift of sorts from British India during her Golden Jubilee. Abdul Karim was just 24 years old, tall, dignified and quiet. Initially hired as a clerk, he was meant to serve her food and stand in the background. But almost immediately, Victoria saw something different. Within weeks, he was promoted to Munshi teacher, and soon he was by her side constantly. For the rest of her life, she would call him the Munshi. He taught her. Hindustani explained Indian culture, brought her dishes spiced with cinnamon, turmeric, cumin. The Queen used to boiled mutton, and cabbage was enchanted. She wrote that the aroma from his kitchen brightened Osborne House. But this relationship was more than exotic curiosity. Victoria once again was finding companionship in a man the court considered wildly inappropriate. She confided in him, gifted him land in India, gave him a private carriage, and even commissioned portraits of him. She held his hand when he was sick. She stroked his neck when he was tired. And she defended him fiercely against everyone. The royal household loathed him. They mocked his accent, his robes, his perceived arrogance. They spread rumors that he had syphilis. Ministers accused him of espionage. Even her own children begged her to send him away. But Victoria refused. "He is my Indian secretary," she declared, "and will be treated as a gentleman." Was it love? Was it maternal affection? Or was it simply the comfort of being seen not as a monarch but as a woman? Her letters to him are tender, even affectionate. He taught her phrases in Urdu, some simple like, "The tea is too hot." Others more intimate like, "I miss you when you are gone." One phrase translated as, "She holds me tight." Whether she ever did remains unknowable, but the possibility scandalized Victorian Britain. This wasn't just about race, it was about class, about power, and most of all, about control. Once again, Victoria had formed a bond no one approved of. And once again, she didn't care. In many ways, Abdul Karim was the last flame in a life marked by quiet rebellion. A Muslim man of humble background standing beside the most powerful woman in the world, receiving letters, gifts, and gestures reserved for princes. He represented everything her court wanted to keep out and everything Victoria insisted on keeping close. But time, as always, was relentless. In her final years, Abdul stayed by her side. She insisted he join her on holidays. She made sure his rooms were furnished with silk. Even as her health declined, She visited him when he was ill, held his hand and promised him safety. When she died in 1901, the court moved swiftly. Her son now, King Edward VII, banished Abdul from court. They seized his letters. They burned his correspondence. They tried yet again to erase the inconvenient parts of Victoria's heart. But history, though slow, remembers. In her coffin, placed by her orders, were 3 deeply personal items: a photograph of John Brown, a lock of his hair, and most controversial of all, a letter from Abdul Karim. It was her final act of defiance, a declaration in death of the people who mattered to her most. As Queen Victoria entered her final decade of life, the world around her had changed beyond recognition. Railways crisscrossed continents. The telephone had replaced the hand-delivered letter photography. Once an experiment was now capturing images of war royalty and working-class life alike. But Victoria remained a constant in a world that never stopped moving. She was no longer the young bride who had wept on her wedding night, nor the withdrawn widow who vanished for years. She was now a global icon, a grandmother to half of Europe's royal houses, and the longest reigning monarch the world had ever known. Yet behind the medals, portraits, and titles, the woman was still wildly unpredictable. She could be sharp and politically astute, able to navigate the tangled web of 19th century diplomacy with more subtlety than many of her ministers. And yet she could also be shockingly petty. Her letters reveal a deep distrust of certain politicians, particularly those who challenge her emotionally or intellectually. She had a sharp wit, even a sense of humor, but rarely showed it outside her journals. She claimed to value dignity above all, but kept hair clippings from her servants and grandchildren, storing them in labeled envelopes. She gave her name to an era defined by propriety and moral restraint, yet loved melodrama, broke social rules, and formed scandalous attachments. She was a paradox, and that may be exactly why she endured. At her core, Queen Victoria was a woman constantly resisting the roles others placed upon her. As a child, she was manipulated by her mother and controlled by advisors. As a wife, she was ruled by Albert's discipline. As a widow, she was expected to quietly fade. Instead, she loved men her court despised. She challenged her ministers. She insisted on keeping people like John Brown and Abdul Karim in her life, not for political reasons, but out of loyalty and affection. And that refusal to conform to palace expectations, to gender norms, to public pressure, is what makes her story still resonate today. She lived a life of emotional extremes. She mourned obsessively, laughed loudly, and wrote compulsively. She could be cruel, but also remarkably tender. She resented change, yet presided over the most transformative century in British history. In many ways, Victoria's contradictions reflected the contradictions of her empire. Progressive yet oppressive, elegant yet violent, proud yet precarious. When she finally died on January 22nd, 1901, the world paused. Her death marked not just the end of a monarch, but the closing of a century. Inside the mausoleum at Frogmore, where she now lies, are the tokens she herself insisted be buried. With her, a photograph of John Brown, a lock of his hair, Abdul Karim's final letter, and the wedding ring from Brown's mother slipped on her finger in secret. They were not the items of an empress. They were the private treasures of a woman who had loved deeply and defied convention every step of the way. As we look back on her life, we find not just a queen, but a fully human being etched in ink across millions of words in her journals. Her legacy is not just imperial, it's intimate, it's flawed, and it's real. She gave her name to a world, but she gave her heart to a few. Queen Victoria's life defies simple storytelling. Was she a powerful monarch or a fragile widow? A traditionalist or a quiet revolutionary? An emblem of imperialism or a woman just trying to be heard? The answer, like the woman herself, is all of it, and that's exactly what makes her story so worth telling. For much of her reign, Victoria lived in the tension between public duty and private desire. She performed sovereignty in front of millions, yet clung to letters, hair clippings and handwritten journals in secret. She inspired fear and respect in ministers, but sought comfort in the presence of a gruff Scottish servant and a young Indian clerk. She was, in short, gloriously human. And that's the paradox. The Victorian era named after her is remembered for rules, hierarchy, modesty and control. But the woman at its center, she lived in emotional extremes. Her attachments were messy. Her relationships scandalized a nation. Her grief was unapologetic. Her loyalties wildly inconvenient. She outlived the love of her life. Then she outlived the man who helped her laugh again. Then the one who brought her dignity in politics, and then the one who brought her warmth in her final years. And with each loss, she wrote, she wept, but she moved forward. Today, in an age where the world often demands perfection, Victoria's life reminds us of something far more important: authenticity. She wasn't perfect. She could be controlling, temperamental, even selfish. But she also loved deeply, thought fiercely, and refused to let others define who she was, especially in her later years. She ruled an empire, yes, but more impressively, she ruled her own narrative. In her journals, spanning over 50 million words, we hear not the voice of a distant monarch, but of a woman struggling to hold on to identity, emotion, and meaning in a world constantly reshaping her. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the titles, not the thrones, but the reminder that behind every symbol of power is a person. A person who misses their husband, who worries about their children, who wants to feel seen, who struggles with loss and clings to love. A person who, in the end, doesn't want to be remembered just as a ruler, but as someone who felt everything deeply. Victoria's life didn't just shape an empire. It revealed the cost of carrying the world, while also carrying your heart. So the next time you hear her name, don't just think of the Empress, the crown, or the black veil. Think of the woman who dared to love where she shouldn't, who mourned longer than was proper, who kept writing when everyone wished she would stop, who ruled a world yet never stopped being herself. That is her greatest triumph and her truest lesson for all of us.